Krusty the Clown awoke with a jolt, his oversized shoes scraping against a floor that wasn't quite right. The familiar gleam of his TV studio was gone, replaced by a decayed husk of itself. The lights overhead flickered like malevolent eyes, casting jagged shadows that danced across walls dripping with black, tar-like ooze. Shards of broken glass littered the ground, glinting faintly under the stuttering glow. He staggered to his feet, wincing as the glass bit into his floppy soles, sending sharp stabs of pain up his legs. "Hey, hey! What's the gag here?" he muttered, his voice trembling. But the only answer was a low, distorted hum, like the canned laughter of his show warped into something sinister. Panic seized him. He stumbled toward the exit, his heart pounding beneath his garish purple suit. The door loomed ahead, a rusted slab of metal promising escape. But as he shoved it open, a cold gust sucked him back. He landed hard on the studio floor, right where he'd started, the door slamming shut with a mocking clang. He tried again, another door, another hallway, only to be spat back to the same spot each time, the studio folding in on itself like a cruel, endless loop. The air grew thick, pressing against his chest, and that warped laughter swelled, drilling into his skull until his ears throbbed with wet warmth. He touched them, blood trickling down his fingers. Then came the audience. They materialized. From the shadows, filling the bleachers in an instant, children, or what might have once been children. Their faces were wrong, swollen and lopsided, with eyes bulging like overripe fruit, glistening in the dim light. Their mouths stretched wide, packed with jagged serrated teeth that clicked as they grinned. "Present the show, Krusty." They shrieked in unison, a cacophony that rattled his bones. "Make us laugh!" The sound was deafening, a tidal wave of noise that made his vision blur. He clutched his head, staggering toward the stage, driven by some unseen force that coiled around his limbs like invisible ropes. On the stage, his old props waited. A spotlight flared to life, blinding him. All right, you little monsters," he croaked, forcing a grin. "How about a magic trick?" He grabbed his battered top hat, hands shaking, and yanked it open. But instead of a rabbit, something wet and heavy slithered out. His own intestines, glistening and alive, spilled onto the floor, wriggling like worms. He screamed, dropping the hat, but the organs kept coming, looping around his neck in a grotesque noose. Pain seared through him as they tightened, only for his body to knit itself back together, the torment resetting as the audience howled with glee. Okay, how about a joke?" he gasped, desperate to appease them. "Why'd the clown cross the road?" The words barely left his lips before they twisted into something else. Black, shiny bar roaches erupted from his mouth, skittering up his face in a frenzied swarm. They burrowed into his eyes, their tiny legs clawing at his sockets, and he clawed at his cheeks, shrieking as the audience's laughter drowned him out. The bugs vanished, leaving him panting, but the damage lingered, his throat raw, his vision smeared with tears. Then he felt it, a burning itch beneath his skin. His clown makeup, that gaudy white mask he'd worn for decades, was no longer paint. It fused to his flesh, searing like molten wax. He scratched at it, nails digging in, but each scrape tore away chunks of skin that bled thick, inky black. Beneath, more makeup emerged, layer after layer, an endless cycle of torment. "Get it off," he wailed, collapsing to his knees. The stage trembled beneath him, and the floor split open, a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth glistening with saliva. It swallowed him whole, his screams echoing as he plummeted into darkness, the audience's laughter chasing him down. When the fall ended, he wasn't in the studio anymore. The void spat him out into something worse, a new nightmare waiting to unfold. His eternal punishment had only just begun. Krusty hit the ground hard, his oversized shoes slapping against a surface that oozed beneath him. The studio was gone, replaced by a twisted parody of Springfield. The streets stretched out in jagged, uneven lines, cracked and weeping a thick, viscous sludge that clung to his legs like tar. Above, the sky pulsed a deep, angry red, as if it were a living thing, its surface rippling and dripping scalding droplets that sizzled on his skin. He stumbled forward, coughing as the air thickened. With a rancid stench, burnt sugar and decay. "Where the hell am I?" he rasped, his voice echoing unanswered into the void. A shadow loomed ahead, and Mo Sislak shambled into view, but he was no longer human. His face was a writhing nest of tentacles, slimy and black, sprouting from where his eyes and mouth should have been. They twitched as he thrust a mug toward Krusty. "Drink up, pal," Mo gurgled, his voice bubbling like boiling tar. The liquid inside was dark and steaming, reeking of sour hops. Krusty's hands moved against his will, grabbing the mug and tipping it to his lips. It wasn't beer. It was acid, searing his throat and melting his stomach into a bubbling mess. He doubled over, vomiting black sludge, only for his insides to reform. The pain resetting as Mo forced another drink into his grasp. "Bottoms up!" The bartender cackled, tentacles lashing the air. Staggering away, Krusty rounded a corner and froze. Homer Simpson lumbered toward him, a grotesque blob of flesh, his body swollen and pulsating. Rosquinhas, dozens of them, were crammed into his gaping maw, but they burst apart, spilling wriggling maggots that crawled over his face. "Heya, Krusty!" Homer bellowed, his voice muffled by the writhing mass. He lunged forward, arms outstretched, and engulfed Krusty in a suffocating embrace. The weight crushed his ribs, the maggots burrowing into his suit, squirming against his skin. Gasping, Krusty shoved free, and Homer dissolved into laughter, collapsing into a puddle of dough and worms that slithered away. The streets twisted again, and Marge emerged from the haze. Her towering blue hair moved like a nest of serpents, hissing and snapping at the air. Her eyes were hollow pits, staring through him as she whispered, "You corrupted our children, Krusty. You poisoned their minds." Each word sank into his skull like a needle, stirring memories of every crude joke, every sleazy scheme. The snakes lunged, wrapping around his arms, their fangs sinking into his flesh, pumping venom that burned through his veins. He screamed, thrashing, but Marge only watched, her serene smile unchanging as his body convulsed. Then came Bart, a feral grin splitting his face, a rusted knife clutched in his hand. "You were my hero, Krusty," he snarled, "but you let me down." He charged, the blade flashing as it plunged into Krusty's chest. Each stab was a memory. Every time he'd pawned off cheap toys, every cancelled show, and the pain bloomed, anew with every thrust. Blood sprayed, soaking Bart's spiky hair, but the kid kept laughing, a manic edge to his voice. Krusty stumbled back, clutching his wounds, only to feel them seal shut, ready for the next assault. Desperate, he fled down a narrow alley, the walls pulsing like living flesh. Empty beer cans littered the ground, but as he kicked them aside, they sprouted sticky, skeletal hands that clawed at his ankles, dragging him down. He tore free, heart hammering, and spotted it. A glowing door at the alley's end, shimmering with a promise of escape. "Redemption!" he gasped, lunging for it. He threw it open and leapt through, hope flickering in his chest, only to crash back onto the studio floor. The audience was there, larger now, their deformed faces melting into a single, grotesque mass of eyes and teeth, roaring with laughter. "You can't leave, Krusty," they chanted, as the doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate once more. Krusty landed back on the studio stage, the impact jarring his bones, but the pain was only the beginning. Invisible hands erupted from the floorboards, cold, clammy fingers that latched onto his arms and legs, pinning him down. They tugged at his skin, peeling it away in long, wet strips, exposing raw muscle that glistened under the flickering spotlight. He screamed, thrashing against their grip, but the flesh knitted itself back together, only to twist into new, grotesque shapes. His arms elongating like rubber, his chest bulging unnaturally. The audience's laughter swelled, a tidal wave of sound that drowned his cries, their bulbous eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see his father, Hyman Krusty, towering above. The rabbi's face was a decaying ruin, skin sloughing off in ribbons to reveal bone beneath, his eyes hollow sockets leaking a dark, oily fluid. "You shamed me, Herschel," he intoned, his voice a low rumble that sliced through Krusty like a blade. He raised a skeletal finger, and it stretched impossibly long, piercing Krusty's chest with a sickening crunch. Each word Hyman spoke, failure, disgrace, clown, drove the finger deeper, twisting through his ribs until blood bubbled in Krusty's throat. The old man's judgment lingered, a weight that crushed his spirit as the wound closed, ready for the next condemnation. The stage dissolved, and Krusty found himself in a circus tent, the air thick with the stench of rot and grease paint. Payasos, dozens of them, each a warped mirror of himself, surrounded him, their faces melting like wax, eyes drooping from sockets, mouths stretched into rictus grins. They juggled knives, the blades glinting as they arced through the air, but the throws went wild. One slashed across his arm, another buried itself in his thigh, and soon they were upon him, tearing at his flesh with gleeful cackles that echoed his own "hey, hey" laugh, distorted into a nightmarish chorus. His body regenerated, the wounds sealing just in time for the next barrage, an endless performance of agony. The tent faded, replaced by a claustrophobic room lined with mirrors. Krusty's reflection stared back, but it wasn't him. Not quite. The images warped, his nose ballooning, his hair sprouting into writhing tendrils, his mouth splitting to reveal rows of jagged teeth. The reflections stepped out, each clutching a piece of his past, a cigarette that ignited his lungs with every forced puff, a bottle of bourbon that poured down his throat, burning like molten lead. They attacked, pinning him down, forcing the vices into him until he choked, his body convulsing as it rebuilt itself for more. "Stop!" he begged, but the mirrors only multiplied, trapping him in a kaleidoscope of torment. He clawed at the floor, screaming for mercy, but his voice summoned the audience again. The children poured in, their bodies fusing into a single pulsating mass, hundreds of eyes blinking in unison, teeth gnashing from a dozen gaping maws. They surged forward, engulfing him in a tide of flesh, their laughter vibrating through his bones. He felt himself dissolve, then reform, spat back onto the stage, the cycle unbroken. Through the haze, he glimpsed others. Lisa, her fingers bleeding as she played a sax that wailed in agony. Barney, drowning in a flood of acidic beer. But their eyes were blank, their pleas silent. No one could save him. Krusty fell to his knees, the weight of eternity crushing him. "Please, forgive me," he whispered, tears streaking his ruined face. The floor quaked, splitting open into a yawning void, blacker than anything he'd seen. It swallowed him, pulling him down with a force that tore at his soul. He flailed, grasping at nothing until he landed, back on the studio stage. The audience loomed larger, their faces a grotesque tapestry of flesh, chanting his name in a deafening roar. He realized then there was no escape, no end. His punishment was forever, a loop of suffering spun from his own failures, and the curtain would never fall.